Thank you very much, Andrew. That's a super interesting presentation, and there was already some comment about the Mario Kart, which you're still running here. And I think we'll all now try to play Mario Kart to experience being, first in the back and then coming back into the front. You see a number of clapping hands here already. And with that, I would like to invite points for discussion, question, contributions to Andrew. We have a few modelers in the group, as far as I can see. I myself am not one of those, so I will not be able to provide any constructive questions here or comments. So please, who wants to go first? Who would like to raise a point or add from their own experience? Johannes, please go ahead.
Okay, hi Andrew. Thanks for the nice presentation. It was very, very interesting and how do you call it? Unterhaltsam in German. Yeah. I have a question. When you showed the example of, for example, solar panels or solar pumps, I was thinking in your model, so you have economic variables but also behavioral things like attitudes. So let's pick that example. So you say there are subsidies for certain investments, and there are attitudes of farmers towards these investments. So how do you bring them together? Because in a pure economic model, it's just, if it pays, it's adopted, right? And so I'm interested in how you handle that ambiguity between those two issues.
Sure. So, right, and this kind of, I suppose this cuts at a lot of the core of agricultural extension and development and sort of studies of technology diffusion. And yeah, I think when something is a good idea and is well known to be a good idea and is clearly a good idea at least in the near term, people just do it. And this is really common for I think like new seed varietals and like drought tolerant rice or this and that other thing. In the models, some of the things we try to account for are that, and this is particularly true in so in South Asia, where you have medium through large gravity-fed irrigation systems and different levels of certainty about access to surface water and sort of different, access to longer planning horizons from like head to tail in an irrigation system. You see a lot of different, or I guess I should say like uncertainty about whether this thing that's good for you is also good for me. And so in an agent-based model, for instance, we can use algorithms that help us capture the idea of, I relate to my neighbors, I learn things from my neighbors, but I have some understanding that their production function is different than mine. And I develop over time some understanding of how, when I see you doing well with this technology, I have some level of confidence of how it would perform for me. And so we can capture, for instance, then the idea that I see it's working for you, but I don't yet believe it would work for me, or I know that it wouldn't, or I know that it would. And we can capture that sort of like how things play out over time. You also have the opportunity where in systems where you have learning, for instance, and there are a lot of programs that sort of follow this theory of change of like, let's throw this thing out and let's get the wealthier farmers to buy in first in a way that spurs local production or local maintenance firms or whatever that shifts cost and knowledge over time. And then as you see that knowledge spillover play out, you then have the sort of reservation price of participation shift for other farmers, and you can capture that sort of dynamic. I may or may not be answering your question, but I mean, I think it allows us to get around this idea that, yeah, people either do or don't, and capture some of the ways in which preferences, beliefs, and information shift over time.
Yeah, if I may chip into this one, I guess what you mentioned a couple of times is this uncertainty element, and that's something that I always find very interesting to see how you integrate that into the model, how you deal with this uncertainty, because of course you don't have just this dichotomy of you do something or you don't it, but there's this entire black box basically. Can you say a few words about that? How to deal with uncertainty and how you do that in your models?
Yeah, and I guess I would say this is, and you probably have this experience in just about every scientific domain. As a modeler and as a coder, once you're a good coder, you can capture anything you like, and it's very easy for us to represent, the experience of uncertainty and decision making under uncertainty in a model. The harder thing is to sort of like calibrate and validate that against real decisions. And what really complicates that is, as much as, and we do the best that we can when we develop behavioral experiments, but when you work with real people and you design some instrument, it's difficult to know. Maybe a better way to say this is when you play a game or run an experiment, there are all kinds of layers of behavior that people bring to your game, and it's difficult to capture unless you have a lot of money and can do things at a big scale and have lots of respondents, how they're responding to the specific things that you care about. And in particular, as it relates to uncertainty, it can be difficult to know whether people are learning about uncertainty through your game, whether they are learning about the distribution of opportunity in your game as they play it, or whether they are coming with a fixed understanding or belief about uncertainty and applying it to what's going on in your game. That's three of probably many other possible explanations of how people respond to uncertainty, and it's difficult to pull those out. And just an example is when we play games in areas where there's a lottery that people tend to play on their own versus where we play in areas where there aren't lotteries available, you have very different sort of underlying understandings of probability and uncertainty. And the way we would interpret results from an experiment end up being really different. So all just to say, this is a challenging research frontier. And if it's of interest, Carlo Roncalli, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, did a whole series of like farmer field schools and workshops on training in how can we have farmers interpret probabilistic weather and climate forecasts. And so she has a nice body of work that looks at what are the ways in which people understand these things differently. And I think it's a really nice insight into how you should think about someone's response to an uncertainty component of a game you've done. Sorry, long answer.
Thank you. Super. Super. Thank you very much. Tina, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrew. I also enjoyed your talk. And I have a kind of related question to Hannah's question about uncertainty. Mine is going into the direction, how do you actually take gender intersectional aspects into account? Unless I'm referring to theory, but more, how did you do it in practice then? Because you talked a lot about like investments, pro-poor investments. But I mean, pro-poor, the poor are very, very diverse groups. So we have men and women in there, then we have different age groups who are also poor, we have different ethnicities, we have more marginalized and less marginalized people. So can you give us some concrete examples how you addressed that and what were outcomes and what were your different policy implications?
Sure. No, that's a really good question. And often it's worth emphasizing when I've done a lot of this work like in partnership with IFPRI and other groups in the CGIAR system. And for those of you who worked with any part of the CGIAR, you would know that in some places they have great long-term connections and good relationships with extension agencies and sort of have the opportunity to work in communities where people trust them. And in other cases, you don't. In other cases, they're kind of coming in new. And depending on the degree of trust you have there, your access to, well, I shouldn't say it that way, the likelihood that all of the people who you would wish to speak with will be available to you and will share with you how they think and feel about things is different. It is often the case that we get, for instance, mixes of age and education and gender in group games and group experiments that we do. But I'm sure any of you who've conducted a focus group in your life, for instance, have the experience of there's a group of people and there's literally the loudest person is talking and I don't know anything about what other people are doing. So all of this is to say, in a sort of like unsatisfactory answer to your question, that often you're constrained by what is locally appropriate, how you can dig into these things. So for instance, when we've done a lot of work in Bangladesh and Pakistan looking at irrigation, and most irrigation decisions are men's decisions. And as much as we would want to understand the sort of just gender dimensions of how, as decision-making shifted, what we might experience, we don't really have a valid construct for doing so, because we're not able to construct groups that are mixed in gender that are meaningful, and because we're often not able to engage with female heads of household in that particular context. So again, I'm probably half answering, half not answering your question, but I think really the answer is just where you have long relationships in a place and you're able to have connections with the people you want to engage with, you're going to be better able to generate instruments where people will share what's actually going on. I think some of the most exciting work I've seen in this space is the like intra-household bargaining work that Jessica Hoel and Katrina Kosek have done with these sort of like ball and cup household bargaining games. I think that's a really great example of what you can do to try and learn about how vulnerable groups are making decisions in a way that they're comfortable showing you.
Cool. That has answered your question, Tina. Good enough.
Sorry, it's a great question, and it's just really hard to answer.
You can, yeah, I guess this also, you can discuss that much further. And what I liked about your answer was you said, that where you know the people, you can actually build a much clearer model. Sure, because you have more details in your possible answers. That's cool. Is there any more additions to the discussion?
Well, maybe while people think, I would ask
Yeah,
you for
go ahead.
then, Andrew, because you said it's difficult to establish mixed focus groups, which I know, and people won't speak, but then I was wondering, can't you do separate focus groups and then even go further into details? You have women from from certain ethnic minorities grouped and so on, so that you really try in these more econometric or economic approaches to get that diversity, because I always think that that's lacking in economics, and it's always like, it's so difficult, blah, 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 and our tools are already complicated. But then I always feel a mismatch from more the social science, and I just wonder, are there more solutions to these issues?
Yeah. So on that, we have this work that's in progress. We through the CGIAR, they have this nature positive program, and one of the little slices of work they're doing is we have 3 sites around Kisumu in Kenya, where groups of farmers have agreed and signed a contract to do an aggregate farming project. And as part of the sort of ag extension and development component of that, we did one of these games that I showed along with a community debrief exercise and a follow-up 6 months later, where in that game, we very deliberately constructed groups of all of the female heads of household, the male heads of household, and mixed. And what we found were really different results in what people chose to do in the games, where we saw conflicts emerging in the games, and how successful groups were. And what's interesting is when we did our 6-month follow-up, like some of the messages that people held on to was, we've done better when women have had more and greater roles than they've traditionally had in our individual farms. Let's hold on to that and see what the spaces are for mixed participation in this aggregate farm. So it's a nice example. We haven't published it yet, but where we're getting at that and trying to use this sort of mixed methods to, better engage with participants and learn different things, I guess.
Maybe staying at that point, I'm just wondering, Dorcas, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you want to share maybe how you dealt with stakeholder engagement in your work, in your preparation for your modeling? How what measures you did in order to try to get a good representation of stakeholder groups?
Sorry for being late. As explained, I had a mix-up of the time. So normally we have a representation of everybody who is going to be affected or anybody who is going to affect the decision that is at hand. So for example, in the case of farmers, we would have the farmers, would have people from the ministry, would have the input dealers, would have the people from the financial institution, anybody who can really have an impact on that. So a pretty much good representation of the stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Are you able to distinguish between male and female farmers? Do you have focus groups discussions, or do you just not have enough people in order to segregate?
Ideally, when we have, let's say, calibration training to get the input estimate, we don't separate between male and female because we try to have everybody on board. and all of them in one room. But if there is a need to separate, maybe we can do that. But in Ghana, we didn't do that. We had all the experts, because even the farmers are experts in our case. We had all of them in one room. Yeah.
Cool. I take the opportunity that nobody else is raising their hands. Please do feel free, all of you, to raise your hands or ask questions. I do have a question, or maybe a request for a little bit more information. You in the beginning of your presentation, you presented all these different games that you had there, and there was one I pricked up my ears on land tenure. I thought that was quite interesting because we also deal with land tenure issues. Again, coming back also to the gender dimension. Land tenure, how gender affects land security and these kinds of things. How can you give us a little bit more information about that specific game?
Sure. So that first game was called Shared Space, and it's since evolved into a related game called Follow Me. And if I'm actually probably the world's worst multitasker, but I'm going to do my best while we're talking to share the links to those publications here. But the structure of these games was basically to say, if we mix in a space, so imagine we have a grid, and in each grid cell, you can make a decision to grow a thing or let the land recover, sort of like you would imagine in like a fallow or a slash and burn or like a rotational farming system. And all we do is we change whether across the landscape, what parts of the landscape are privately held, meaning one person makes all the decisions for this part of the land, versus held in common, meaning lots of people make decisions, and potentially if I might choose not to grow something in this space, someone else might. And so we're sort of mixing in one space the sort of like private agricultural problem and then a commons dilemma, and looking to see what are the kinds of incentives that on the one hand lead to the greatest level of agricultural production, but then also which lead to the healthiest soils or the greatest sort of level of provision of ecosystem services. And we adapted that game in a few different ways. One, and this is recently published, looking at what are the right encouragements for mixed vanilla agroforestry in northern Madagascar. And then we have another Madagascar application of this specific game ongoing right now that's looking at encouraging, or how do you encourage people to leave old growth native forest alone, whether it's by putting rules in the space or just encouraging or subsidizing like fast growth pine or other things like this in other places. And so that, I mean, they're relatively simple games and easy to sort of reskin and reframe around different problems. So if you have a problem domain where you want to apply a land tenure game like that, it would be not difficult for us to repackage either Shared Space or Follow Me to fit your problem. And I'll see if I can find the publications easily.
Would the aim of the playing the game be to raise additional questions or to get people to think differently about what they're doing? Or is the aim of the game for you guys to gather data on how people decide in certain situations?
So
why would I play it?
It's a really good question. And I have other talks that I probably could have wrapped around where we talk about the sort of different objectives of doing games. So sometimes we're developing games as research instruments. I want to learn about how you make decisions because I want to inform a model or some other thing. Sometimes we're using games as learning tools where I want to provide you with this sort of like, risk-free exposure to a valid construct that you face to sort of enhance our opportunity to talk about and focus on the dilemma that's real to you. And then the last is thinking of them as sort of boundary objects where different people know different things about a problem, and we use a game tool to help, for instance, policy developers and resource users get themselves on common footing to discuss the problem. So those are there are many other ways we could use games. Those are the three that we focus on. And while you might use the same game in each of these different contexts, probably your intervention design is going to be different depending on what your goals are.
So you have an open platform, and then it can be used in different ways. Cool. I think we should play games more. Tan, maybe when we come and meet in Accra, you can bring a few board games with you. Can play a few. Cool. Over to you back, Tina. You raised your hand again. please.
Yeah, I think you started partly touching on the question that I was about to raise. Hannah and I were just and it's a bit out of the context of your presentation, but since Hannah and I just joined a intense discussion here at CEF on what is development? How do you define development? And as a background, we are here in CEF. I mean, we have ecologists, we have other natural scientists, we have nutritionists, economists, of course, who do lots of modeling, like more in your area. And then we have the hardcore social scientists who come with very different ideas of development. And so in this discussion, we heard all these sorts of different perspectives, and also strongly, you probably know this discourse also, that we should much more look at definitions of development or perspectives of development from the local people. So basically, what do the rural poor define as development? So you gave some examples like on the forests, how to actually make them not use the forests, or you had on one of your slides, the future science says, and I know this publications, I probably also agree from my scientific perspective that farming should be rather middle scale, and these tiny farms won't survive, and we should offer them alternatives. Though when I imagine I would be a really poor farmer, and you come along with that and tell me, well, whatever alternative, and you have to live in a city and work in a fabric, and that is a cool thing. Hey, I wouldn't like that. So I'm sometimes wondering, can we, in the research we do, especially I think then more economics, also in ecology, it's sometimes the same, model more, like starting with this premise of what do the real poor think and want, and their perspectives. And do you know research? Not that you have to do it, but do you know people who do research around and trying to plug that into an economic model? Then more here's a problem, we collect data and try to solve the issue.
I'm gonna.
It's a bit challenging. Sorry, I just came into my mind when we had this discussion. I thought I hear your viewpoints and your experiences on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I fell out of love some time ago with a lot of the way we do, for instance, like international development and agricultural development in particular, because a lot of it is just like, hey, we came up with a thing, how can we make you do it, right? And that's what a lot of extension ends up being. And so that kind of got me more into thinking about what are the ways that agricultural extension can be better about building problem-solving skills and putting people in a position so that we're cutting ourselves out. And really, this is, I think, what development is meant to be, right? We happen to have been privileged with all acts. Well, we happen to have taken so much over history that we as individuals were born into privilege, are able to do all these things. And there's a way in which we can, I don't know, make good use of what we know by helping other people who don't know it as well as we do, or haven't had the schooling we have, or whatever, learn things better, build capacity in a way that we can cut ourselves out, and we're not there. We don't have this sort of like unequal north to south exchange anymore. So I don't know how to get there necessarily, but in our lab, sort of one of the dimensions along which I think we make progress in that direction is through starting with sort of like co-production processes from the beginning. So we do a lot of, in the modeling work, of identifying what is the group of, I want to avoid saying local knowledge, but what are the group of users connected to the more closely connected to the problem than we are, who we can bring together to help get on a common footing, have a common language about what it means to do model development, identify questions and processes that we care about, and then build that model together so that we all have a shared understanding and we're all able to use outputs in the same way. And presumably, eventually, without us, the model can be adapted and changed and rebuilt and made use of in our absence. And so that's the kind of goal. We've done this. We have sort of 3 ongoing projects where we're doing this. One in Senegal that's sort of wrapping up. One in Brazil, in the state of Rondônia, where we're looking at forest management. And then one in Madagascar, where we're looking at migration response to climate shocks. But in all of these cases, I mean, I sort of have like a gut feeling of what works and what doesn't, but all of these processes, if you really want to do participatory work, it's exhausting and it's long, and it's, the Senegal work has been ongoing for 5 years without us all being able to be enough on the same page to have a good output that we're happy with. And it's very much, the participation changes along the way. People who were excited at first moved on to other positions and aren't with us anymore. And we have new young technical people. And so, and this is maybe half answering your question and half not. So I'm sorry, but I'll do the best that I can. But it's a difficult thing, one, to get funded. It's a difficult thing to sort of have young scientists participate in. And so there's on the sort of like global north side, we need to enable that. We need to support that. We need to make that possible. The other thing that is just really hard, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, is even from the planning stage, having equal partnerships among North and South researchers is really, really hard. And it's one of these things that it's fun to say, and I like to walk around and say, yes, we do this and we're good partners. But when the rubber hits the road and you have a deadline to meet and it's hard to connect and you have sort of different like work culture understandings about timelines and everything like that, it gets hard. And in practice, often what happens is the global north scholars will just trample all over everything and say, fine, we had to make a decision, here's your budget, right? This is this ugly thing that we do. And we all have this experience, like, and sorry, I'm getting on a bit of a soapbox, but when I get into projects with a bunch of other middle-aged white guys who look like me, it's so easy because we all think the same and we talk the same and we end up doing some narrow, stupid thing that we all agree on. What's much harder is just doing the hard work of being in this group with people who care about different things and want different things and have different references. And it's always going to be hard and it's always going to lead you to this better thing. But it's really difficult to encourage. And our science agencies, if they survive in the US, the current administration, I think could do better to promote exactly that kind of exchange. Anyway, that's a bit of a soapbox, but I hope it was appropriate.
Thanks a lot. It was nice to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I think we can all relate to that very well. Yeah, absolutely. Especially in these kinds of projects that we run. Yeah. Cool. We are nearing the end of our time slot. Any last chances by anybody who wants to ask Andrew a difficult question? I can see some of the coins. People, Niklas, Stephanie, Johannes. You're all satisfied. You got enough input to think. Cool.
Maybe just since you mentioned my name, I was about to type in the chat. Yeah, this is really very interesting. And thanks for talking so openly also about drawbacks, difficulties, and even long projects that did not fulfill all expectations. I think this is a much needed process attitude.
Yeah, I think that's important, no? To also for young scientists to know that it's not always, not everything works out the way you planned at the beginning. Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time, Andrew. All the best for your future. Thanks, Tan, for organizing, for brokering Andrew to speak at our colloquium. All the best to you while you're still in Cornell, and we'll see you online in between, and most of you in person also in Accra in June.